Hi, I'm Max Cervantes. I was a prop maker for Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise, as well as having been an extra on The Next Generation and Star Trek The Undiscovered Country. And you're listening to Trek Untold.
Hello and welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. This week on the podcast, we're talking about props and making props for Star Trek with one of the people who worked on TNG, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise, as well as some of the movies. And that person would be Max Cervantes. Max was basically born a Trekkie and has been a lifelong lover of the franchise. To say it was a dream come true to work on the series would not punctuate that statement nearly enough for Max. And not only was he a prop maker, he was also a background actor in a few episodes of The Next Generation. Beyond Trek, he's also worked on many other projects, which unsurprisingly his IMDb page lacks. So you're going to learn about some of those today as well. These days, Max is hosting his own show, the Max Effects Podcast, which is a monthly podcast where he takes a deep dive into his career, including his work in Star Trek, other films and shows he's worked on, and even some other peculiar things like designing theme park attractions. Max always knew he wanted to build props for a living and be in the industry, and has a great story about getting his foot in the door, and many more fun tales about the very unique things that he's made in his time working on props, including some secrets that you might not know about, some otherwise fairly ordinary props that you have seen plenty of times in Star Trek. I don't think I knew too many of these things either before this show, so there's definitely going to be some new things here you haven't heard before. This is a real fun one here with a lot of information you diehard fans are going to love. So grab a drink from 10 forward and enjoy this chat with prop maker extraordinaire, Max Cervantes. But before we begin this week's episode, I want to remind you about the different ways that you can support Trek Untold. If you're in a position to help us financially, we have a Patreon page at patreon.com/trekuntold, where you can support us for as little as $2 a month. Joining at higher levels allows you to have early access to the latest episodes, knowing in advance who our guests will be before anybody else finds out, or even the chance to submit questions to some of those future guests, and maybe your question might be heard on that episode. Shout out to our sponsor, Triple Fiction Productions, who create 3D printed toys and prop replicas inspired by Star Trek. Their items come in all shapes and all sizes and are always amazing, but you're going to hear a little bit more about them later on in the show. But most importantly, I need you to leave a review and rating on iTunes or wherever you're listening to Trek Untold. 5-star ratings and positive reviews help this show pop up when new listeners search for Star Trek podcasts and make sure that they know they're listening to something that is worth their time. If you're watching this episode in video format on YouTube, please leave a thumbs up, share the video, and of course, comment there as well. Interacting on all these platforms is a guaranteed way to spread the word about Trek Untold. So if you've been a fan of this show, please do take action in whatever way you can and help make sure that Trek Untold can reach more listeners just like you who are going to love this type of content. And don't forget to follow us on our social media pages, which includes Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. All you need to do is type in @TrekUntold on any of those platforms, search for us that way, and you will find us just like that. You can also watch the video version of this episode on our YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/nerdnewstoday. The video versions are released on Sundays, so the audio version will always come first, but if you prefer watching it, that's the way to do it. We also do a lot of other Trek-related content there, including toy and book reviews and plenty of other stuff, so you might want to take a look too, just so you can indulge and get yourself a new daily dose of Trek nerddom however way you like to get it. Now, without further ado, let's bring in this week's guest and get this episode started. Computer, beam in this week's guest. Hello and welcome back to Trek Untold. Now joining us on the other side of the screen, we have someone who's working in the special effects industry for decades, and he's worked, of course, plenty of times in Star Trek, but not only off-screen as well as a few times on-screen that we're going to talk about today. That person is Mr. Max Cervantes. Max, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on board.
It's so great to chat with you. You know, you are actually our second prop maker we've spoken to, and our first time was Michael Moore. We actually mentioned you a few times, your name come up a few times, so I'm excited to actually chat with you.
Yeah. Mike is one of my oldest and best friends. We've known each other since about, oh gosh, I want to say back to 83.
Wow.
Yeah. I was in his wedding party, so I'm good friends with him and his wife. I am called Uncle Max by his kids, so
Oh, very cool. We're going to be talking all about him today, I'm sure, as we go on, because he was, I'm sure, a big part of what was going on with the Star Trek props. But
Most
first things,
definitely.
oh yeah, absolutely. So first things first, Max, let's talk about what is your earliest memory of Star Trek?
My earliest memory of Star Trek, because I am 61, I barely remember seeing the Enterprise fly by on TV when I was a little kid, probably in its original release. But I don't really remember watching it then because, of course, I was maybe 7 or 8. But I definitely remember and really, really loved Star Trek when I saw it in the reruns during like the early 70s when I was in junior high school and high school. I would watch it religiously because there was nothing like it on television. I mean, don't get me wrong, The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone, they're awesome, but they didn't have that continuing story. They didn't have a continuing cast of characters. And again, I love Lost in Space, the original, the first season of it, because it was pretty good sci-fi. But then it became really silly. It was just became this campy kids show. And I really loved the fact that for once somebody was taking science fiction on television seriously.
And we should add that you are a pretty hardcore Trekkie, and I know this is going to probably come up throughout this interview as well, but you're like pretty legit. You've been going to like conventions for years, right?
Oh yeah, the very first convention I ever went to, I was 16 years old. It was at the Marriott Hotel here in Los Angeles at LAX, and that hotel, the Marriott at Los Angeles International Airport, is still there to this day. And that's the very first convention I ever went to. It was organized by John and Bijo Trimble, who everybody remembers were the people who started the Star Trek Save Star Trek campaign so that we would get a third season out of Star Trek. And I later became very good friends with them. And so, yeah, that was my very first convention when I was only 16. I almost got excommunicated from my Roman Catholic family for not going to Easter services, but of course, because I wanted to go to a convention. So I went.
I think it's a fair trade-off.
I certainly thought too. I certainly thought it was, and it led to me meeting lots of great people, and eventually it led to me getting into the business. So yeah, I'd say so.
And I'm glad you mentioned the Trimbles as well because I didn't mention this yet, but you also have a podcast now called the Max FX Podcast, which we're also going to discuss a little bit later on in the show. And I know that Bijo was one of the guests on one of the earlier episodes.
Yes, I had John and Bijo and their daughter Laura, who like Laura's an old friend of mine, and we're about the same age, so we went through a lot of the similar things at the same time. Only she did it with having a pair of parents who were super, super famous within sci-fi fandom.
Yeah, so we'll discuss some more of that podcast later, though. I just wanted to bring it up because, yeah, I've been actually listening to it as part of my research for this interview. I've been really
Oh,
enjoying it, really
wonderful.
liking the stories,
Good.
and it was so cool to see that you had the Trimbles on. I'd love to get them on as a guest as well sometime. So I'm glad you're
Well,
also keeping that
because
alive.
and exactly because I as I go along with my podcast, I want to interview more and more people from my field, from behind this camera, because I feel too often fandoms tend to focus too much on just the actors, which is great. They do their part too, but let's not forget all the hardworking people behind the camera. The art directors, the graphics people, people like myself doing props and miniatures and such, and the people doing the costuming. All of those sorts of people, I think, get forgotten too much when it comes to sci-fi fandom. You know,
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's also kind of the purpose of Trek Untold. We speak with a lot of actors, but I love speaking to folks like yourselves because, you're very much a mystery too in a lot of ways. I mean, I had to do a lot of digging to find out what I could about you. I mean, I'm so thankful that you got a podcast now because I'm like, all right, taking
yeah.
notes, writing down that story, I got to ask him about this. But folks like yourself, there's not much out there. And that's unfortunate. So I'm glad we can actually talk about what you do, your profession, and how people can learn more about it.
Well, thank you. And the podcast came about because um, my good friend Kevin Toft, who's my co-host, he said, Max, Kevin and I have been really old friends for a long time too, and I'm always telling him stories about things that happened at work or things that I've heard from other people that happened at work, at their jobs, and during projects, different movies and such. And he said, you need to get all these stories together and put them in one place, otherwise they'll get forgotten. And he quoted the movie Blade Runner, which is what kind of geeks we are. He said, otherwise they'll be forgotten like tears in the rain. And I thought, that's kind of poignant, but he's right. You know, we all have our stories in our lives, and if they're not passed on, they get forgotten.
Do I need to check now to see if you're a replicant, or can we keep this interview going? Now I'm concerned.
No, because I would turn the turtle over if I found one roasting in the desert sun.
Okay, good. We got that established. You're not going to pull off any legs of spiders, right?
No.
Okay.
No.
So let's just start with a few other standard questions here that I always love to find out. We're going to go deep into
Mhm.
the past now. So, Max, you tell us where you were born, who your parents were, what they did, and what did little Max want to be when he grew up?
Well, I am a Southern California native, born and raised here my whole life. I grew up in a little city called Corona, which is about, for people who don't know, it's about 45 minutes east, I should say 45 miles east of Los Angeles, about 15 miles east of Anaheim, where Disneyland is. Uh, my parents are Robert and Lupe Cervantes. My dad was a craftsperson in different ways. He eventually got a job working for a company doing electrical work, and he was a supervisor installing electrical systems in mobile homes. And my mom was a housemaker. And I had a unique thing growing up in that my grandfather, when he came here from Mexico, he immigrated with my mother. My grandfather's Anthony, and my grandmother Anastasia. They immigrated here from Mexico. He had worked for the trains company in Mexico and the United States, but he had been always wanted to be a farmer. So when he came here, he thought, I'd like to stay and have a farm of my own. And at first, he wanted to move to Kansas, and my grandmother smartly convinced him not to, because she said, well, there's wonderful farmland here, and we're much closer to family still back in Mexico. So he gave in, and they stayed here in Southern California. And he bought a parcel of land, which is about, I would say, about 3 city blocks square piece of land. That's a lot of land, but back then, of course, you could get land cheap. And he had it as his farm for many years. And then as he started having a family and getting older and not wanting to use the land for farm, as his children got older, he gave each of his children a parcel of land along the street frontage of what was the farm. And so I grew up with my parents living on the street here, and then next to them was my Uncle Bill, and next to them was my Uncle Raymond, and then there was 2 other plots of land for 2 of their other children, and then my grandparents. So I grew up with all of my relatives living on the same street with me, which it's kind of odd. I mean, how many people have that happen to them?
Did you always want to go into props as a kid? I mean, did you have other aspirations for a different occupation?
I no, actually, I always did, because ever since I was a little kid, I loved building things. Like I said, probably from being around my dad and my uncles, my 2 other uncles, my Uncle Bill and my Uncle Raymond. They both built homes. They were both contractors, and my dad did electrical work. And then my other uncle, my aunt's husband, my uncle by marriage, my Uncle Tito, he was a mason. He did concrete and stone work. So all of my relatives all were in creative fields, and so there was always like lots of scrap wood and other stuff laying around. And back when I was in junior high school and high school, there was lots of industrial arts classes that, unfortunately, it's a real pity in my mind that these sorts of things aren't available to kids nowadays. I took wood shop and metal shop and different types of crafts like that, where I really learned how to do things. The very first prop I ever made was a hand phaser. I had seen a pencil sharpener in a department store, and I thought that kind of looks like a hand phaser. And so I bought it with my chore money. And and first of all, my favorite book growing up as a little kid was not some picture book. It wasn't a fiction book. No, my favorite book growing up as a kid was The Making of Star Trek. I must have read that book so many times, seeing how funny it was about the funny little note wars they would have, sending notes out. Like Gene would send a note out to production, making note about this and this and this. And because of these great edicts coming down from him, he was given the nickname the Great Bird of the Galaxy. One must do what the Great Bird of the Galaxy says, and they'd have all these funny little notes going back and forth about, well, we really like this dress on this actress and it looks great, but how are you going to keep it on her when she moves? And that's what you'd find about how they do things like that. And they would use a material called toupee tape, which was used for keeping a man's toupee down on his forehead. Well, remember that really slinky outfit for Who Mourns for Adonias? And that Leslie Parrish, the actress, is wearing that pink Roman toga that just barely on her. Well, they used toupee tape against her skin to keep it on her. And so in reading that book, I learned all these amazing little things. As mentioned, it had pictures of props. And again, back in the 70s and such, we didn't have access to that stuff. Kids nowadays are spoiled by so much great information out there. And so I was just looking at the pictures, and I took this little pencil sharpener and I added some stuff to it, and I glued some other stuff on it, and I painted it by hand with a brush so it looked like crap when it was done, but it was mine and I had done it myself. uh the first model I ever completely scratch built, like I said, I liked Lost in Space as a kid. I made a model of the Jupiter 2 saucer that was 18 inches across, all by hand. And it was wood and poster board and little bits of plastic. And for a scale for figures, I used the old figurines that came with the Star Trek bridge model kit that AMT put out back in the 70s. So I built it using those figures as my scale. But you could take the roof off of the model. You could look inside and see the whole upper deck. The landing gear folded down. You could pull the space pod down out of it. The upper deck doors opened and closed. You could slide them open and close manually, the inner and outer airlock doors. And I did this all when I was 16, 17, and I even have pictures of it. My uncle next door had a big sand pit, that they would dig sand out of it when they were going to go do concrete work. Well, of course, I went out there and I made myself a little landscape of it. And I put the Jupiter 2 down there, and I put my little toy chariot that Mattel Toys had put out. And so I took pictures of my stuff even back then. My next model I did after that, I was building a model for myself of the Galileo shuttle from classic Star Trek in scale to the Mego 8-inch tall action figures. So you can imagine it was pretty big, with the figure being 8 inches tall. Sadly, I don't have any pictures of it, and it was destroyed when our house got flooded in a really, really heavy rain. There was a storm drain next to our house growing up, and the storm drain became clogged with debris, rushing down it from a heavy storm, trees and boulders and such, and the water jumped out of the storm drain and it flooded our house. And unfortunately, my Galileo shuttle, which was all made out of wood and cardboard, was destroyed. So I've always liked building things ever since I was a little kid.
Now, I heard a story that you told actually on another interview I listened to, and I think you've said it on your podcast as well, about how you got to tour the set of Logan's Run, and that was like a real important moment for you as
Oh
someone
boy,
working towards
it
being a
was.
professional in that field.
Yes. Growing up in California, they used to test all the students for their IQ level, in the hopes that if they found children who had a higher IQ level, easier ability to learn at an accelerated rate, they would put them in a special program so that they wouldn't get bored. And I was put into this program in third grade. I was tested out with having a 137 IQ in the third grade, and with the reading and comprehension ability of a second-year college student, which would explain why I just read through books quickly. And so I got put in this special school. I was in this special school run by the government for these mentally gifted children. And we had all sorts of extra things. Like I learned to type when I was in 5th grade because they just gave us typewriters. And they said, here, have fun, do it. If you want to handwrite your homework out, if you want to type it out, do it. Anyways, later in high school, they had a similar version of the program. And when I was in high school, my special counselor, I was in 11th grade at the time, he said, well, what do you want to do with your life after you get out of school? And I said, I love science fiction and horror and monster movies and things like that. I want to do special effects stuff because I'd always been watching these movies. I mean, my best memories of spending time with my dad was getting to watch old sci-fi movies, on Sunday afternoons on TV because we didn't get to go to the movies that often. And so my special counselor said, well, give me a list of a bunch of your favorite movies. And I did. And one of them was 2001. And my counselor, bless his heart, he didn't really know about the movie industry and how things worked. He didn't know that 2001 was actually made at MGM Studios in England. He didn't know it was made there. He thought it was MGM Studios here in Los Angeles in Culver City. Anyways, he called them. He cold called MGM Studios. He got a hold of the head of the special effects department, who was a gentleman by the name of Glenn Robinson. And he told him my story. And Mr. Robinson was like, sure, you can send him over and I'll let him come over and visit and I'll give him a tour. And so on December the 27th, 1976, I was dropped off at the front gate of MGM Studios with two of my best friends from school. This was in high school again in 11th grade. And earlier that same year in 76, the movie Logan's Run had been released. I loved it. I saw Logan's Run in theaters 13 times that one summer. That's how much I loved it. Mr. Robinson, who's this great big bear of a guy, very jovial, very happy and jolly, he smiled and he took the three of us into the studio and he showed us around the whole studio. He showed us the sound stage because he said, well, I hear you're a big film history buff. He said, this is the sound stage where they filmed The Wizard of Oz way back. This sound stage was completely filled with the Munchkin Land set, and I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. He took us to another sound stage, and before we went in, he says, this sound stage was custom built for Esther Williams because she was an Olympic swimmer and she's very beautiful, and they wanted to push her as becoming an actress. And they built this special sound stage with a pool built into it so they could do all her swimming movies, which were quite the thing back in the 40s in this soundstage. Well, at the time they were using it, it was used as the ice cave set for Logan's Run because although a lot of the ice was fake, but some of the ice was real. But some of the large blocks of ice, as they would melt, they smartly did it in this soundstage because all the water would drain into the pool as it melted and not be a problem. And he's taking around the whole place, and he took us to lunch in the commissary, and he was telling us, oh yeah, these tables, that was, this particular famous stars, this was their favorite table to sit in this place, and this and that. And after that, he took us to more of the sound stages, and we walk in, and this sound stage is where they had shot the carousel set from Logan's Run, and they were disassembling it that day, but it was still up. And the bottom of the carousel set, there was this big sort of like beige carpet where the big red crystal was, and you could see the burn marks from where it was blown up and it had been exploded for the finale of the movie. And I asked him, well, why are they taking it apart? He says, well, the movie's done. Movie was a big success. They spent like $8 million making the movie back in 1975, and they had brought in almost $30 million, which was a huge hit for the time. Hell, nowadays they spend $30 million on just one actor's salary. Anyways, and he said, and they figured they had shot enough of background footage that if they wanted to do anything with it, a TV show or a sequel, they had plenty of stock footage they could use. And he took us into Logan's apartment set and the New U and all these sets. And eventually we ended up back in his office, which was in the special effects department. And he's just telling us all these great stories. I got to see one of the full-size maze cars, which was sitting there. They were made using an electric golf cart, and they just built a body around it. And the maze tunnel tubes, though, they made one tunnel tube that was full size, and it was long enough that they had to open up the doors between two sound stages. So the tube went from one sound stage, the full length, out the door of one sound stage and into another one. And this way they could just shoot down the tube, the whole full length of it. And then they put a mirror at the end of the tube so that it would look even further by having a mirrored reflection down it. And he's showing us original props from Logan's Run, the Sandman's gun, which were custom made, and two of them actually worked. The rest of them were dummies, but the two that worked had a acetylene tank in the back of them. So when you pulled, you'd first flick a switch in the front on, because there was a little glow plug in the barrel of it. And this glow plug is like what's used on model airplanes, model gas-powered airplanes, to ignite the fuel. And then you'd pull the trigger of the gun, and the acetylene gas, which is kept in the back of the tank, would rush forward, hit the barrel, blow out the four ends, and catch fire all at the same time. And he said, and we made the flame look green on camera by taking a black piece of felt that they cut into the shape of like a washer that they stuck in the barrel, and they would dip it in water with this copper powder. And when the acetylene gas hit the copper powder, it would pick up the copper, and that's why the flame would become green. So it would show up, because otherwise the acetylene blast didn't really show up on camera really well. So it was another one of those cases where they had to alter it so it would show up on camera well. He brought out a box, and he showed us several life clocks, one of them including the working blinking one that Michael York wore. And the life clock is small. It's like about the size of a nickel. And it was just a thin piece of plexiglass that they cast, some acrylic resin they cast. I don't know who sculpted the original of the crystal, and they would cast them with acrylic resin. And for the blinking one, they embedded two tiny little, what are called grain of wheat incandescent light bulbs inside it. And then there was these super fine wires leading away from it, which were then glued down. The makeup artist glued them down into the folds of Michael York's skin, so you wouldn't notice them. And then once they got past, the wrist, they were going into a sleeve, and they didn't have to use makeup at that point. But it went down to a small power pack using 3 AA batteries and a self-blinking light bulb, like a Christmas tree light, so that the light bulb in the palm of the life clock would blink only because the other light bulb was blinking and breaking the circuit. That's how simple it was. And he said, well, you want to have things simple on set, because what if it's really complicated and then it breaks down on set? How are you going to fix it quickly? Because time is money on set. And so, we're wrapping things up, and he got into that little box of crystals, and he goes, here, I want you to have this as a memory of this visit. I was like, wow, this is awesome. Thank you. And he says, we actually didn't make very many. We only made them for the principal actors, and that's only if they thought it was going to be seen. Otherwise, all the huge masses of people you see in the movie, the wardrobe department lined everybody up based on the color of their costume, and they took a Sharpie and they just drew a disc of color in the palm of their hand. So there'd be something there, but otherwise. And it was a green crystal he gave me. He said, so this is either Jenny Agutters or Farrah Fawcett's. And I said to him, I'd prefer to think of it as Jenny Agutters myself. He said, well, good for you. And I said to him, but this has really been wonderful, but I have to ask you, why did you agree to see us and spend all this time with us? He said, well, when your teacher told me about you, and he told me how much you loved making things and that you loved science fiction and fantasy stuff, he said, it just kind of reminded me of me. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I'm going to retire this year. I have spent my whole career here at MGM. I started here when I was only 17 years old, so just a little older than you are. And he said, my very first picture here was Forbidden Planet. And he said, I love science fiction and fantasy stuff. And so for me, this has been a dream job of getting to work here all these many, many, many years, starting up from just a lowly assistant and now retiring. I'm the head of the department, you know, and he won 2 Oscars that year, one for the Dino De Laurentiis King Kong. He built the giant mechanical arm that could swing in and pick up people and you know, move objects. He had built this amazing system with all these little sensors on a glove and on an arm that you would literally wear, and whatever you did with your hand and fingers, the giant mechanical arm would do as well. And so he won a special technical Oscar for that, and he won a special technical Oscar for Logan's Run, most notably the carousel. The carousel was able to lift 18 stunt people, the flyers, all at the same time, while the plate at the bottom rotated, while there was also a matching plate up in the ceiling that could rotate both in perfect synchronicity, you know. And so for all the other technical achievements Logan's Run, he got a second Oscar for that.
And then interrupting that heartfelt moment, Box burst through the wall and started flailing his arms around, yelling fish and sea greens, plankton and
Oh,
protein from the sea. Is that how the tour
oh,
ended?
you know, Box unfortunately had a very sad story ending. They only built one of the Box suit, but they had multiple pairs of the arms because they used air conditioning, like from a dryer, clothes dryer tubing, you know, that flexible ducting. They used that for its arms, and they found somebody who could like spray a chrome plate onto the flexible stuff. But the more you flexed them, of course, this chrome plating wasn't made to stick on that kind of plastic. It would crack and peel off. So they did multiple arms, multiple sets of arms for Box, but only one head and only one body. And it was worn and manipulated by Roscoe Lee Brown, who was a very well-known Shakespearean actor on Broadway, and that was his real voice. They didn't alter his voice. That was his real voice.
And to put that into reference for folks who are my age, also, he was also the voice of the Kingpin in the Spider-Man animated series from the mid-90s. That's how I first found out about Roscoe Lee Brown.
Exactly. So if you do an IMDb on Roscoe Lee Brown, you'll see he just worked forever and ever. You know, back then, the studios didn't value things like props or sets and costumes. It was done. If they thought it could be reused, it would go into storage. If they didn't think it could be reused, it went in the garbage. And you know, the Box character dies in the movie, so they thought, well, what's going to happen with this? So Box got tossed in the garbage. And the story I was told by another friend of mine who had worked on Logan's Run is that this publicity guy who had done publicity for Logan's Run, he saw it out his window. He saw the Box suit in a garbage bin, and he went down there and he got it himself, and he dragged it out and he had it in his office for some time. And after that, I don't know whatever happened to Box, but at least he didn't end up in a landfill. He's somewhere out there, hopefully, you know, in somebody's living room. But yeah, a lot of stuff just ends up getting tossed. The giant, I did get to go back for a second visit. Mr. Robinson said to me, he introduced me to his assistant who was going to be taking over after he retired. Oh, I remember now, Jimmy McLennan. And Jimmy McLennan was going to be taking over after he retired. And he said, if you'd like to come back again, you know, you're more than welcome to come visit. And so I did. And this was like Easter vacation. So a few months later, after Christmas, after this first visit. And by this time, they had decided to make Logan's Run into a TV series. And I had then brought some props I had made for myself of the Logan's Run Sandman pistol and of their little tracking device, which was called a follower. And I brought them, and you know, I was such a little nerd boy. I had found this little briefcase, and I had them in my little briefcase, and I brought them to set, and I'm showing them to him, and he goes, "Oh, those are really nice." And you know, so we left them there while he took me and my other friends with me around to show us the different sets. And we went out into the prop storage area, and there was the giant mirrored hand from the center of the arcade area from the movie, the giant mirrored hand. And it was in two pieces because there was like from the wrist down to the forearm and then the hand itself. So they were sitting next to each other. I was like, oh, if I could, I wish I could take this home and take care of it, because it's just sitting here getting dusty, and it's made out of mirrored plexiglass on a wooden frame. So it's not like it's super, super durable. Anyways, we go back to set with Mr. McLennan, and my props are gone. My briefcase is sitting here, which the props had been sitting on, but my props are gone. And I'm like, what? I'm starting to freak out a little bit. And Mr. McLennan calms me down. He says, don't worry about it. And he calls over to one of his assistants, and he says to his assistant, he goes, what happened to the pair of props? I hear the Sandman stuff that was sitting here earlier. He goes, oh, I figured we weren't going to need them for the rest of the day, boss. So I put them away. And Mr. McLennan turned to me and he goes, well, kid, you fooled my guys. He thought it was good enough to be our stuff. Do you want a job? He right then and there offered me a job, and he wasn't kidding. He offered me a job to work at MGM at 17, because of course I, 1 year, my birthday's in December, and so I was now 17. And I said, oh my God, that's really awesome, but I don't think I could do that. I'm in 11th grade. I don't own a car, and I live 45 miles away from here. He said, well, if you ever, reconsider, give me a call and everything. So I was like, wow, that was kind of mind blowing, to be offered a job at 17. And believe me, if I could have worked it out, I would have taken it.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Now, did you actually go to school to learn more about prop making or any of this type of thing in the industry, or did you go right to work?
No, I after graduating from high school, I got a job, first thing, working in the aerospace industry down in Irvine, California. This company I was working for was named Symbolic Displays Incorporated. I'm not even sure if they're still in business, but basically the interior of your airplane cockpits, the display screens back then were a piece of plexiglass which had little light bulbs embedded in from behind, and then the panels would get spray coated with like a diffusion white paint, and then they'd get spray painted again, and they'd photo etch all the little letters, everything you're going to see, onto them, so that the black paint would fall away after being etched. And my job where I worked was to look at these panels. So I basically worked in a little cubby hole, like about the size, a little bit bigger than a bathroom, with this device, which I would look through the device, looking at the panel, and it would give me light measurements of the different letters. And my job was to make sure that the panel lit all nice and evenly and everything. And I worked there, like I said, for about 4.5 years while I put myself through college, because my parents weren't rich. So I put myself through college. And I knew that they used a lot of plastics now in special effects work. And I looked into finding schools that taught about plastics. And I found one that did, and it was in Cerritos, California, and it was Cerritos Community College. So I went and applied. And the guy who was the teacher was a fellow named Terry Price. And he had gone to Cal State Long Beach, which is where a bunch of the original model makers for Star Wars had all studied industrial arts, industrial design and such, which also included model making. And so he knew of my interest of being into science fiction stuff and everything. So we got along really, really well. And I went to school there for, like I said, for 4 years. And my last year, I ended up being his teacher's aide. And, so that was kind of like my first brush with somebody who knew people who worked in the business. And then getting older and going back to conventions again, because like I said, my first one was in 76, but I didn't go to another one again until like 78, when Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars started becoming a big deal at conventions. And it was then I started meeting people who had worked in the business. And one of the first people I worked in the business that I met was Greg Jean, who's incredibly talented, very, very famous model maker. Greg built the mothership for Close Encounters. He headed up the model effects for Steven Spielberg's 1941. And Greg's just, just a huge name in model making. So when I met Greg said to me, well, if you ever get to move to Los Angeles, give me a ring, because unfortunately, you living so far away, nobody's going to hire you because they need people who are close by. And so when I finally did move to Los Angeles in '84, I took Greg up on it and I gave him a call, and Greg hired me to do, a little job for him. The TV series V was out at the time, and Greg gave me a mold that he had for the little shuttles. And he had me make, I think, like 25 of them. I can't remember the number. So it was my job to cast, paint, and detail them out, and then give them all back to him. And when I had them done and I took them back to Greg, I said, well, what are these for? You must be doing like a huge shot of like a hangar bay to have all these little shuttles. And he laughed. And again, this was another learning moment. He goes, oh, no, these are giveaways. I'm giving these away to the production, kind of like, a little gift, so they always remember you. And so I learned early on, so it's sometimes it's nice to, butter the bread, as they say, to do the sort of nice things for the productions and such.
That's a good lesson to learn in your first job, for sure.
Oh yeah.
And on that note too, I mean, I was trying to look at your IMDb, but it's really kind of comically empty. Like there's so much missing. And again, like I mentioned,
I've never set up an IMDb, so whatever's there wasn't set up by me. So maybe one of these years I should get around to doing that.
Well, whether you do it or someone else ends up doing it, maybe I'll end up doing it for you after this episode. But
there you go.
Let's kind of clear up some things here, because I have a few ideas of some stuff you've worked on, but I'd like to hear from you. I mean, can you kind of run down some of the different productions that you've worked on doing special effects and making props?
Well, the very first movie I ever worked on that I got my name in the credits was the science fiction teen comedy film Real Genius, starring Val Kilmer. After working with Greg, I literally just got out the phone book. See, because kids back in the day, we didn't have the internet. We had telephones, and there was these big things made out of paper called books. And it was specifically giant lists of everybody's phone number. And I just picked up the phone book and I literally went through the phone book looking for names of shops, effects shops. And I found one that was called David Stipes Productions, and they were in North Hollywood. And I cold called them and I said, hey, I do sound chat. Are you looking for any help? And a couple days later, I got to go and I interviewed. I showed them a few of my little things I'd built for myself, and I got a job. And Dave Stipes and his wife, who ran the company, were wonderful people. Dave himself started off as a stop motion animator, I believe. He used to do all the stop motion animation with a good buddy of his named Dave Allen, and they stop motion animated the the Pillsbury Doughboy for all the old Pillsbury commercials. Now it's all done with CGI. And Dave branched out from there and having his own company. And Dave was doing a lot of the visual effects for the V television series. There's this great shot that Dave did for the TV series. And it starts off with the Earth, and the Earth starts falling away. Of course, the camera's really backing away from it. And as the Earth just keeps getting smaller and smaller, then suddenly you see one mothership fly in overhead, and then another one from underneath, and then another one over here and there. And then suddenly you pull back and you see the moon, and you see this whole fleet of like 6 motherships is all hiding behind the moon. And the last one, which is the biggest one you get closest to, was the great big one that Greg Jean had built. And he did that whole shot, and there was no optical work. It was all done live in front of the camera, just shooting the models on black poles with a black velvet background. And it just blew me away how convincing it looked and how good it looked on camera. And it was all done live, right there. And that really told me how talented Dave was. So like I said, I worked on Real Genius. I worked on some low budget films for Roger Corman. One of them was working at Dave's called The Stuff. The Stuff is a horror comedy film. I think Garrett Morris is in it from Saturday Night Live. And it's about, they find this organic like yogurt material in a mine, and people start eating it, and it's delicious, and they find, oh, the more you eat it, the more you lose weight. So they start selling it as a dietary aid. Then they find out the bad thing. It's alive and it's eating people from the inside out. So the more you eat of it, the more it eats you. I did my work on The Stuff over at Dave Stipe's shop, and we did some model work. There's a shot during the end of the film. I've been trying to collect all the movies or TV shows I've worked on DVD or Blu-ray, and The Stuff is one of the only movies I haven't been able to find. But near the movie's climax, there's a mine explosion. Some people just take it into their own hands. No, we're going to destroy the mine to make sure that this stuff never gets out again. And they blow up the mine, and we built a large miniature of this mine, and we had a model of a tanker truck in the bottom for scale. And my job was, we blew up the model using what's called an air mortar. It's a tank with pressurized air, and it's got a solenoid valve. And so when the solenoid valve is tripped electrically, it suddenly releases all the air out all at once. And it would blow air through these 4 ducted points in the model, and it would just blow all this rock and debris up into the air. So every time we would blow it, it was my job to reset it by literally gluing all these little rocks on top of each other very, very lightly with just a tiny little bit of white glue, and then dusting it with a little bit of sand on top of that so it all blend together. And I think we did that like 5 times. So it meant like it would be a whole day of having to reset it for 30 seconds worth of filming. And we did some shots of the stuff rising up out of a big lake in these like kind of pseudopod shapes. And that was done in a tank shot that we built ourselves on the soundstage. And I made these pseudopod puppets. Dave had given me some sketches of what they wanted them to look like. I sculpted them out of some clay, and to save time, rather than making molds and pouring them, I used the actual sculpture by dipping them into a bucket of latex rubber and then bringing it out, letting it air dry, and then dunking it again and repeatedly doing this. So basically like making a rubber glove in the shape of this pseudopod. And then we would use the glove in the tank, so we could have the pseudopod rise up out of the tank, and the stuff would drip over it, and it looked really goopy and gross and everything, and it looked fine. And then we had a rear screen projection behind that, so that they could project the image of this big cave, so you saw the rest of the cave with the stuff coming up. Funny story about that filming though is that it happened around 4th of July weekend, and it was going to be like a 3-day weekend. We weren't under a rush, so we didn't have to work over the weekend. And so at the end of the day, we turn off all the lights and everything and whatnot. And over the 3-day weekend, the tank of this goop leaked all over the soundstage floor. And thank goodness the motion control camera setup was set up on little feet, so that it was about 2 inches up off the floor. But this stuff just went everywhere on the floor, on the soundstage floor. And to make matters worse, we were gone all 3 days, so you don't leave the air conditioning running. And this stuff went bad, so it smelled like bad pancake batter. The stuff for the tank shot, we made it out of methicil, which is what they used as a key component in the Ghostbusters for the slime, only they tinted it green, and we tinted it white, and with a little bit of white paint. So imagine methicil and white paint sitting on a hot soundstage floor for 3 days with no air conditioning. It was awful, and we cleaned it up and just went back to work. But yeah, so I'd done Real Genius there, and the stuff, and a few little things for the television series, and a couple other things I don't really remember. And then I ended up being there at Dave's shop over a year, which was pretty awesome to me for my very first job. And then I went on to work over at Bob Short Productions, and Bob was already very well known. Bob had done Daryl Hannah's Mermaid Tale for Splash for Disney, as well as he did the Cocoons for the movie Cocoon. And I worked for Bob then for several years as well, about like maybe 3 years or so. And while I was at Bob's, we did Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future, kids TV show from the 80s from Mattel Toys. First TV show to ever use CGI on a TV show, let alone for a kids show. And the first TV show to ever be interactive, because the toys the kids had, a gun and these spaceship airplanes, you could point them at the screen and the screen would emit these flashing images that were on characters' bodies or spaceships. And if you target the ships or toys against it, you could like play tag. You could shoot them and score a hit and destroy them or whatnot. And so first interactive TV show ever made. I worked there on Beetlejuice, building a lot of props and special pieces for that. Most notably, I built the carousel hat that Beetlejuice wears during the climax of the movie. Mike Moore also built the carousel hat, because we built 2 carousel hats. The one that Mike built was the one you first see in the beginning of the movie. So as Michael Keaton as Beetlejuice is coming up out of the floor, out through the model, the carousel hat is all folded up like an umbrella. And then as it goes up, it unfolds. So that was the one that Mike made. So it had to look exactly like the other one, which was fully mechanical. So we built 2. Mike did the first one, and I built the second one. And the second one, the shroud for it, the tent-like shroud, I vacuum formed it out of styrene plastic because it would be sturdy. And we needed it to be flexible for the other one, which is why Mike used real fabric. And then I made a sturdy one for the other one. And then all the little creatures had to go up and down like a real carousel. And so I had to devise this whole mechanism inside of it so the little creatures would go up and down while it's spinning, while these 2 bat wings on the side of the head are flapping back and forth. And at the very top of the carousel, there's this little skull. And I remind you, this is long before he had come up with the script for The Nightmare Before Christmas. But this little skull at the top of it, the way he drew it, it looks very much like Jack Skellington. This little skull is the very top of the carousel hat. And then there on top of that, there's this little tiny bat sitting on his head. That part had to stay still while everything else is spinning around it. And there was 500 individually wired in light bulbs into it as well. So it was a ton of work. I also built the mechanical portions for Gina Davis's stretch head, which was really nice to get to meet her. Super nice person, super nice lady. And she was so understanding. It's like, I've known some actors who were kind of complaining about having to wear difficult things, and she never complained a bit about this head. The back of the head was designed in such a way that these kind of like the way the designers sculpted it, it was really wonderful the way they thought it out. There was these little ribs, like the cartoony shape of the back of the throat going. And so every other one of those ribs, we cut it out and we put a piece of black wedding organdy fabric so she could look through it. So she can actually see out from the back of the throat, and she's looking over the mechanical eyes and tongue that I built. And the eyes could look left and right, and then the tongue could rear up like a snake and do this undulation thing. And Burton loved it. But then once we wet it and greased it up with this lubricating jelly, he was like, oh, that's a little too sexual. Yeah. And so they just left it laying in the tongue, and it twitches a little bit now and again to show a little life, but it could do this, they're like, no, we're not going to get a PG rating if we have that thing moving around that much. But Beetlejuice was a ton of fun. There were so many cool things we got to do for that movie. We worked on Masters of the Universe, the live action feature film starring Dolph Lundgren, and that was for I don't remember the name of the studio because they're gone now. Oh,
Was
a
that for
Golden
Landmark?
Globus. Yeah, it was no, it was for Gary Goddard was the director, and he owned Landmark Entertainment. And that's how I later ended up going to go work for Landmark Entertainment, because Gary had also, he had created and directed the Captain Power TV show. And there's an interesting story right in there that shows people, okay, we made all this stuff. We shot the pilot. They shot the pilot up at Vasquez Rocks. And the pilot, it's only like a 10-minute long teaser, like a very long trailer. And then it sat for over a year. And then they came back to us, over a year later. They go, okay, we're going to buy it. Now we're going to make more of the same thing, because we'd only made one of everything, for each character. And the original actress who was Pilot, she wasn't available anymore. And a couple of the other actors, they were gone. They weren't available anymore. So they recast Pilot and a couple of the other characters. So the two characters that were in the pilot that were in the final show were both the actor who played Captain Power and the actor who played Tank. And the actor playing Tank was interesting because he was I believe, Norwegian bodybuilder and powerlifter named Sven Thorsen. And he was good friends with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is how he got into the business here in the States. And Sven's a huge fellow. He's like 6'5", and he was way over 300 pounds. He was a big dude. And I was given a task to make his suit of armor. So I'm having to measure him to make sure everything fits right. Funny things happen on set. We're filming the pilot on a sound stage for all the indoor stuff. And the original concept was going to be, when the characters aren't wearing their armor, they're going to be wearing this spandex bodysuit, kind of like Tron. So it's different colors with all the circuitry patterns on them. And Mr. Goddard took me aside, because not only did I build Tank's suit, but I got sent to set to dress him, to put him in and out of it, since I knew how it went together. And Mr. Goddard takes me aside and he goes, Max, you need to talk with Sven privately. And I go, well, why? What's wrong? He says, he's not wearing any underwear. I'm like, oh my God. So here I am, having to delicately put to this 6'5", 300+ pound behemoth, you got to go put on some underwear. And then he tells me, I don't wear underwear. So next thing you know, I am jumping in my car and running out to the local department store to find underwear for a person this size. And they basically, thank God this happened during lunchtime. So I ran out and did it during lunch break. I'm having to tell him to put on underwear.
That wasn't in your job description, was it?
Not in the least. Not in the least. But hey, it happened. It got taken care of, and they went forward. I'm certain Mike must have told Mike actually went on set when they filmed the series. And so Mike went to Canada for a couple of months when they were filming the show. And I remember Mike telling me a funny story, because I think Tank Sven was the most fun to hang out with, because yes, he was taking this whole thing of being an actor seriously, but he still had this mischievous side to him. And Mike, I think, happened to mention how, his girlfriend was lonely back home and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, you lonely? He goes, hey, you. And he was talking to some girl working on the show. He goes, and he literally went over and picked her up, brought her 2 steps over to Mike. And he goes, here, not lonely anymore. And everybody laughed. Everybody laughed about it. He goes, no, because obviously Sven was joking. He's just trying to be funny and everything. But these Norwegians tend to be a little direct, But Mike has tons of funny stories about being on set for Captain Power. After my time at Bob Short's, I went over and I worked at Landmark Entertainment for Gary Goddard's company. Gary had formed a theme park design company because he had started working at Imagineering. He was a writer. He wrote a lot of scripts for different shows over there. And so he formed his own company doing very similar things. And I worked in the model shop as one of the lead model makers. And I was there for about 2.5, maybe 3 years. And we did lots of different projects. And one of them was we designed a all interior theme park designed interior theme park for the San Rio company. San Rio is the people who own Hello Kitty, and they wanted to have their own theme park, and it's in Tokyo in a suburb area called Tama. It's about 35 miles outside from downtown Tokyo, and we just built so many cool models for San Rio for that project, because the Japanese really appreciate model work. And so if it called out that there would be a brass handrail here in the full-size facility, they wanted us to make it out of brass. So I'm making these miniature little like brass handrails for staircases and big buildings. I mean, I remember we had the roof of this one building. It was going to be all like ironworks with all this glass panels put into it for the entry hall of the theme park. And we had it acid etched out of brass, out of all these pieces. I'm sitting there with a special soldering torch, soldering all these pieces together to make this whole roof out of acid etched brass. So it would be just like what it will be in the full size thing. And we really did some beautiful, beautiful model work there. I mean, some of the nice stuff I got to do there.
Trek Untold will return momentarily.
Trek Untold is brought to you by Triple Fiction Productions. Triple Fiction Productions produces affordable and unique 3D printed Trek-inspired products from the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the movies. Ranging from prop replicas to use in a fan film or cosplay, to accessories or playsets for figures in all different sizes, Triple Fiction Productions has got you covered. Past pieces for toys have included large centerpieces like 10 Forward from the Enterprise D, shuttlecrafts complete with working lights, and the Voyager Bridge, with smaller pieces including Borg alcoves, the Genesis device, and the dreaded arch-enemy of Worf, barrels. All highly detailed products are 3D printed and hand-painted in the USA, with new items added all the time, while simultaneously improving their printing quality based on fan feedback. To learn more about their products, visit triple-fictionproductions.net or visit them on Facebook at facebook.com/triplefictionproductions. Want to get 10% off your next purchase? Use code UNTOLD10 at checkout to receive this discount. Not applicable during sales or clearance events. That's code UNTOLD10 to get 10% off action figure dioramas, accessories, and prop replicas. Triple Fiction Productions, taking Star Trek where no 3D printer has gone before.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Frakes. If you're of a certain age, you may remember me as Commander Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation. And my wonderful brother Daniel died with pancreatic cancer 24 years ago. They opened him up, they diagnosed, they said, "You've got 6 months to live." And that was it. He died 4 months later. And at that time, there was a 3% survival rate. Since then, we've grown to the embarrassingly high number of 10%. But a dear friend of mine, and probably all of yours, Kitty Swink, is one of those 10%. She has survived pancreatic cancer for 17 going on 18 years. Pancreatic cancer is the third leading cause of cancer-related deaths in the United States, with a 5-year survival rate. That's just 10%. And more than 60,000 Americans are estimated to be diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2021. More than 48,000 will die from the disease, because symptoms are often vague and can be hard to detect. That's why I'm supporting the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, the leading patient advocacy organization committed to fighting the world's toughest cancer. PanCan is working hard to create outcomes for this devastating disease through its groundbreaking research in early detection and better treatment options. PanCan drives progress by funding life-saving research, providing personalized patient services, and creating a community of supporters and volunteers like you who will stop at nothing to create a world in which all pancreatic cancer patients will thrive. You can help support our important mission by donating today at pancan.org. Thanks for your time.
We now return to Trek Untold.
All All right, so Max, it's a few of the things you worked on at that point, but we got to get to your Star Trek talk here. And I want to mention, by the way, before you actually were getting into props, you actually appeared on screen a bunch of times in Star Trek. But we're going to save that story for you and your podcast, because you actually did 2 episodes of the Max Effects podcast all about that.
Yeah, I did, but I can go over it really briefly, very shorthand, because if people want the long form version of it, they can go and listen to my podcast where I went into it.
Which they should.
Yeah, which they should. Please go find the Max Effects podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I did 2 episodes talking about my 2 different stints of being in front of the camera for Star Trek. So I'd known Richard Arnold, who was Mr. Roddenberry's personal assistant. Richard put me in contact with the right people, because I was still going to have to go through central casting and all that process. And then the final hurdle was, do they have anything in wardrobe that's going to fit me? Because they don't make them custom for extras. Thank goodness they did find something that would fit me, but it was made for a guy who was 6'3". They took up the pant legs, they took up the sleeves, and I was able to get on Next Gen. And I was on Next Gen from the middle of the 4th season to the middle of the 5th season. And I left Next Gen in the middle of the 5th season only because my old buddy Mike Moore had called me up going, hey, we need some extra people to work on Star Trek. So I went to go work with Mike on Star Trek, building special hand props. And this was the middle of the 5th season of Next Gen. And then we started working the next year on doing stuff for Deep Space Nine.
Again, folks, I recommend you guys check out the podcast to hear more about his stories. He's got a lot of stories about TNG as well as working on the Undiscovered Country. I really enjoyed those episodes a lot, by the way. Those were 2 of my favorites to the show so far. But yeah, so we're now talking about prop making here, and Michael Moore told us a whole lot about the process behind it. But I'd love to hear your side of the story as well, and your take on how, basically, what is the process of making a Star Trek prop? Where does it start? Where does it finish?
Well, it with everything, it starts with the script, and usually there'll be like a brief description of the action, which they'll go into detail about what they need the prop to be, and then from that's given to the design team, like people like Rick Sternbach and John Eves and other people. And so they would then draw something up, and then that has to go to the production staff like Rick Berman and such, and then they give their input whether they want something changed, and they whittle it down to what they want. All of this has to happen very, very fast, because even us as the prop making people, we would only have maybe a week and a half to build something, and then otherwise it's got to be on set. And so then we would get a drawing once approved, and back then it was faster to simply fax us the drawing, and we'd get a fax, and they would always tell us it needs to be like X amount of inches long, so we could then blow up the drawing and have it the right scale. Then we'd just go from there, and then we would talk with the prop master, or sometimes even the designers, and saying, what's this going to do? Are they going to drop it? Are they going to throw it? What are they going to do with it? How durable do we need to make it? Or are they just going to just handle it like regular? Because of course, if you're going to have to build something durable, it's going to take a lot more extra time. There was a prop I built for Deep Space Nine where Captain Sisko and Jake are fixing something in the warp drive in the Defiant during an emergency, and some sort of weird time shift happens, and Captain Sisko disappears in time. And then the rest of the episode is showing how sorry and how hard Jake works at trying to get his dad back from time. And the device that Jake was supposed to be giving his dad gets dropped in the episode. Like, it gets dropped like 5 times in the episode, and God knows how many times it got dropped off camera. And so, knowing it was going to get dropped a lot, I made the whole thing out of metal. It's a piece of aluminum tubing with some brass parts, which were all welded together. So it's really, really durable. But it also had to have lights in it. And so I had to put lights inside it and make it so you could get to the lights in case you need to replace the batteries. Again, it had to be super, super durable. So those sorts of things, what's the prop going to do? How durable does it need to be made? How much time do we have? All of those things going into how we go about deciding how to make a prop. Sometimes a prop can be durable, and we will like vacuum form it. I made this carrying case for O'Brien, which ends up being a bomb, and I vacuum formed it out of panels, and we just glued it together. And it was durable enough that you could throw it and drop it, but I certainly wouldn't step on it or anything like that. And then other times, like for First Contact, we built that really cool new phaser rifle that John Eves had designed. We built, I think, 10 really nice ones. We made 5 rubber stunt ones, because there was the scenes where Worf and others take them and use them like clubs and beat the Borg with them. And then there was one I built that was special. There's a scene where Picard is in his ready room and Lily comes in and he's fiddling with one of the phasers. He's got a panel pulled out and he's working on some of the electronics. I jokingly referred to that particular phaser as the works in a drawer, because the inner workings pull out, with a little slide action, drawer action, and he's sitting there fiddling on that. We only built one of that. There was only one of that built. And then when he picks it up and he smashes it into the window glass, and she says, "Oh, you broke your little models." That was one of the rubber stunt rifles that we built. And even the glass there is not real glass. That's what we call candy glass. Back in the day, it used to be made out of real sugar candy. Now it's just a really, really brittle, clear plastic that they use. So those things drive what and how we decide how to make something.
And we should add too that not necessarily everything you're making is going to be made from scratch. A lot of times you'd be using household objects in your
Exactly.
props, right?
Exactly. Well, case in point, okay, I'll show you right here. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. They improvised in making some things. The communicator used the heavy duty big silver box communicator you see Kirk and Savick using in it were made out of this. This is a Vietnam era walkie-talkie used by the military. Okay. And they use this basic item. They use these pieces on the front inside it, and then they made another aluminum box, and they made the grill separately. But it started off from this, a Vietnam era walkie-talkie, which is kind of hilarious when you think about the fact that they use them for a Star Trek communicator. So yeah, sometimes things get made from things we find out shopping. I remember at one point when I was working on the show as an extra, and I would go up and visit my friends in the art department, like Rick Sternbach and Mike Okuda and John Eves. And I happened to overhear Rick Sternbach talking about that they were going to have to make a Klingon tricorder for an episode of Next Gen. And they didn't want it to look just like the Klingon tricorder that had been seen in Star Trek 3. They figured time passes, technology changes, they wanted something different, but they also didn't have any time and they didn't have any money. And I mentioned to Rick that I had this Japanese toy at home that I thought would make a really good tricorder. So I brought it in the next day. He goes, "Oh, this is really nice. I like this." And I let him keep it to the show, to production. They eventually said no, not because they didn't like it, but because they didn't want to use something that might get them in trouble, since they didn't own it, since it was from a show that had only came out, like a couple of years ago. And so things happen, things change very quickly.
And do you remember what the first prop was that you made solo for a Star Trek show or movie?
No, I really don't, because there's been hundreds, and so I can't remember the first Star Trek prop I ever made officially for one of the shows.
Well, since you were doing hundreds of things, let's just throw that another way then. What would be the typical items you'd be making each week for an episode?
A lot of guns. Okay, I since you asked me to, I did bring out a few things. Jemadar hand pistol that I made for Deep Space Nine. This one's not finished. I lost the little emitter tip. The original of this was made out of plexiglass. Mike has pictures of it when it was still all clear, and you could see it. It was all clear plexiglass. Jemadar pistol, Klingon dagger. I made this Klingon dagger for an episode of Deep Space Nine, the one where Worf's brother commits ritual suicide and he kills himself with this. And the original little Klingon glyphs, I don't know if you can see them really clearly here. There we go. Those little Klingon glyphs were different. Mike Okuda had given me the Klingon alphabet, showing me and telling me, this symbol means A, this symbol means the CH sound, and so forth and so on. I changed the glyphs. that were called out on the dagger. And this glyph that I showed you, that's my initials, MC in Klingon, and that's PE for proper effects. So, and then down here on the handle, nobody's ever seen this because on camera you always see it like this being held, but those are everybody's names in Klingon, their initials on the two different sides that I put on it, just as a little inside joke, knowing that nobody's ever going to see that on camera, but I know it's there. Oh, this is the case where I actually got to design something and everybody loved it. For Star Trek Voyager, I love the episodes where Tom and Harry go off in the holodeck and have their little, their little retro fantasy playland, like old Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers stuff. And this is the Captain Proton gun that I designed and built for that episode. Okay. Again, not having a lot of time. This portion came from a squirt gun. I custom machined this portion, and then I custom made the finger protector ring on it. And I took this to the big convention in Vegas, and I got the actor who plays Tom Paris to autograph it for me.
That's a real one-of-a-kind prop right there. That's
yes,
not only an actual screen used, signed by the actor.
Most definitely. This is something I got because of Greg Jean. Greg, being a huge original series Star Trek fan like I am, Greg has a huge amount of original stuff in his collection. And one of the items I got from Greg, and then he let me borrow his mold so I could have a casting off of it. This is one of the Vion disruptor, I don't know what you want to call this, gun, sensor, whatever, that they would use and point at, Kirk and Spock and McCoy during the episode The Empath. And this is cast off of an original. So that's one of my prized items because, like I said, it's cast off an original from the original series. And then this is a Cardassian pistol. They made two different versions of this pistol. This is the smaller version, and then there was a bigger version. Both of these originally were made by an old buddy of mine, Don Coleman.
Now, I heard a lot of times you were like the Klingon prop guy as well, especially on Deep Space Nine and the other shows.
Yes, definitely. Because I love the Klingons. I love the outfits. I love the demeanor. And I did get to play one in Star Trek 6. I'm one of the many, many Klingons in the courtroom scene, but you'll never spot me because I'm wearing one of those full over-the-head masks, and I'm like 2 levels up beyond where the regular Klingons were. Funny story about that. One of my old buddies, Dan, died. Dan is a big guy. He's like 6'5", and they were looking for really tall guys to be extras for Klingons. So knowing how the process worked, I got him hooked up. He went to Central, got on Star Trek 6 as a Klingon. He worked on it for like more than 2 months as an extra, and he's wearing full prosthetics and everything, right? You can barely see him in the movie, like in a couple of shots. I worked on the movie on Undiscovered Country for only 2 days, and yet one of the days as the engineering crewman, I got these great close-ups completely by accident. So that shows you just how random the movie industry can be. But yeah, so I always got to make all the cool Klingon stuff. This is a Klingon disruptor, which we call the beak nose because of its pointed nose tip. I didn't build the original of this. The original of this was built by ILM's people. One of my buddies, Bill George, who has worked at ILM since, 82. He worked on Jedi. And we got castings of this from Paramount that had been made for Star Trek 3. And so we had to make new molds so we could make new copies and whatnot. Well, when I did this one, I added, it came with this skull and crossbones, like the Klingons are pirates from ILM. And then I added this little plate on it with little Klingon glyphs. And if you look at it again closely, that's my name, MAX, in Klingon. And a whole bunch of them got made with that little piece on it. So, and as well as I do like to collect props if I can get my hands on something. And I don't have that many original screen use props unless it was something I made myself, but this is one of them. This is a Klingon communicator panel that was built for Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. You see Scotty leaning into it and talking into it, saying to Kirk, there be whales here, when they've got them in the pen that they made, on board the ship. And I know you can't see it on camera like this, but right here on the inside, it says, please return to Paramount Prop Department. Oops, I guess that didn't get returned. And one of the odd things that we built for early Deep Space Nine, Rick Sternbach, I believe, designed it, was this Cardassian data pad transferal unit. Think of it as a giant sized flash drive, because when Deep Space Nine first came out, we didn't have flash drives. So this was imagined to be like a big, massive flash drive. This would be clicked into a table, and that's how it could transfer its information back and forth. And then there was a little electronic module that would get dropped into there. But I think they only used it in a couple episodes early on and never seen again. So this is another thing I'd also done for Deep Space Nine. This is a one-of-a-kind prop. It is a Klingon Derringer that I did for an episode where Quark decides he's going to be a gun smuggler and runner. And as a bit of joke, the main portion of this gun, the middle portion of it right there, what you see, that was made out of a Death Star cannon from the toy playset from the Death Star toys from the 70s from Kenner. And I just custom lathed the barrel out of aluminum, and then I glued on the back end of a Klingon disruptor. We had a handle that didn't come out right. The bottom of it didn't cast. It had a bunch of bubbles in it, so I just cut it off, sanded it, glued this part together, milled the nozzle custom, and it became a Klingon Derringer. And they were running short on money, so we just rented it to them, which is why, since I custom made it myself on my own time, I got it back, which is why I got to keep it.
And this should tell you what a giant toy nerd I am, because as soon as you show that off, I recognize that piece immediately.
Good. I'm glad you did. And nobody ever holds it. You just see it hanging on the wall in the episode. We needed to fill a wall full of all these props of guns of different things. So everybody was just dragging out whatever they had. We literally, since they couldn't afford to buy them and we didn't want them to buy them, we just rented all these pieces to them. So I got to make something cool. It's my design, and I got to keep it, and I got paid for it. So yay.
Now, when it came to these other alien species, was there a style guide that you had to follow to know this should be this color, this should be this type of look?
Oh, most definitely. Because our friends over at production trusted us well enough, because they're big Star Trek fans, we're big Star Trek fans, and we eventually worked up a sort of a color style guide. So Mike made this sheet that we pasted up on the inside door of where we kept all of our paints. And most of the times we used off-the-shelf spray cans, because it's faster to simply go get a can and spray something as compared to having to go get paints and custom mix the color. And then what was that formula? Was it this proportion to that proportion, or what? So to simplify things and make things go faster, we used most of the time off-the-shelf custom, off-the-shelf already made paints, and mostly all automotive colors, because car paint is really hard, really tough, and really durable, and comes in a lot of really unusual colors. Vulcan things were usually muted golds and green and maybe some silver. Cardassian stuff was usually metallic browns and metallic golds and coppers. Klingon stuff was always ruddy brown primer with black and gold accents. Starfleet stuff was always this muted pewter metallic with accents of black and silver, and sometimes blue. So yeah, there was a whole style guide of colors that were specific to different races and groups. Ferengis, we used a lot of greens and browns and gold for Ferengis. So didn't you have a question you wanted to ask me about the Ferengi Latinum?
I did. I fact that's actually something I've been curious about for quite some time. So I know there's a little bit of a secret about the Ferengi gold-plated latinum. So maybe you can tell us about what
Mhm.
that is and talk to us about the
Oh,
latinum.
well, yes, there is. With many things, when you're trying to get a lot of stuff done all at one time, it's best to break up the work and spread it around so multiple people can get the same project done at the same time. And with the gold press latinum, the artwork we were given of it was originally formatted, seeing the artwork, upright like a door. And the designer had drawn all these little graphic emblems, the lettering down the front of it, like downward. And we were given different size drawings. I mean, the bars would be made in different sizes, but to get this done quicker, each of us was given a different bar. Like one of our friends, a guy named Bear Birch, he did the larger bar. Then Mike did the middle-sized bar, and then I did the smaller size bar. And again, as a little joke, we changed the alien script. You can't really tell, especially not on camera, but we made this alien script into our names. So the large bar that Bear did, that's his nickname, it says Bear, and then there's this little weird eye-like symbol, and then the other one says Dana, which is his girlfriend. The next one that Mike did, it says Mike Shauna, for Mike and his wife, Shauna. And the third one says my name, it says Max, and then it says Scott, which was my husband, Scott Adams. And so we did this, we got them all made, and then we made molds, and we made up, whole bunches of these things. And just to also tell the fans the correct thing, they're simply painted Krylon bright gold paint. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just Krylon gold paint right out of the can. We didn't age them or do anything to them. Now, the paint does age under natural circumstances. They take on a kind of an odd patina darkened gold color with age. And we'd been working with, we'd made them and they'd been using them on the show for over a year. And then the prop master came to visit one time. He goes, "Hey, what the hell's up with this alien money stuff? I can read people's names on it. What's up with that?" It's like, we said to him, it's like, think about it. How long have you been working with this stuff up close and holding it and having it on camera? And you just noticed after more than a year? You think anybody at home on camera can see that? And he goes, "Oh yeah, I guess you're right. Oh, okay." And so he never noticed. It took him over a year to notice. And much like what Greg Jean did in giving away all those little alien V shuttles, we did a similar things. I made a brand new mold that had never been used for resin. And you can use the silicone rubbers we use also for pouring chocolate into. And so taking the smallest of the 3 gold press latinum bars, we probably made up about 50, maybe 70 gold pressed latinum bars out of real milk chocolate. And then we wrapped them in gold foil and we gave them out to the production as a Christmas giveaway. And again, sort of like the bread, butter the bread of the production company. It's like, hey, remember us? And many years later, when the Star Trek Experience opened in Las Vegas, guess what they did? They made gold pressed latinum chocolate bars, which they sold over there.
Yeah, it's really cool. And as you mentioned, we looked at some of those Klingon props a few moments ago that had different names and things like that. I mean, what other props were there that had secrets like that, and how often were you able to get away with it?
Oh, quite a bit for Deep Space Nine. The orb case that the orb of the prophets is held in, Mike and Bear made that, and they had quite a bit of fun doing that. There's this ring that goes around the glowing oval that's on the outside of the case. If you were to see it up close, you would see engraved in it, it says, "Not Indy's Ark," as if to say, this is not Indiana Jones' Ark. And then the weird stone patterns that are on it, several of the stones are shaped like letters, and it says, "No Kill I," which is taken, of course, from classic Trek with the Horta, where it etches into the ground, telling Kirk and Spock, "No Kill I." So we did it as a little joke on the orb case. We were always doing funny little things like that. I remember one episode of Deep Space Nine, Regina Pancake, who was one of our other prop makers, a real talented female prop maker. Her dad had been a prop maker for years and years and years. The two of us, we had to build this big perfume case. It was shaped like a pyramid, and the sides would fold down. And we had to take hundreds of, not hundreds, but a whole bunch of little bottles to fill the shelves of this case. Because there's somebody, who sells perfume, so they just put it down, fold the sides down, and you can see all their wares all at one time. We had to make all these little tiny bottles, and we did the same thing, putting our initials of different people on the bottles and little funny little different symbols on them. Early episode of Deep Space Nine called Follow Along Home, where they're playing this weird game that takes them into like this alternate realm where they're playing a game, and the game is to get out of the system before
it's Move Along Home. Yeah.
Thank you. Move Along Home. We made the game pieces that they used on the giant game board. The people at the studio made the giant game board thing, but we made the game pieces. There were several that were drawn up very specific shapes, and then after that, the prop master said, just make things. We need to fill the board up with game pieces. So we made pieces. One of them is the Guardian of Forever from classic Trek. One of them is the Monolith from 2001. One of them was like the stylized shape of the Cyclops monster from classic Lost in Space. And so we just went crazy making funny little shapes that we knew nobody would recognize. One of them was a sphere with a tall pointed spire next to it, which is very iconic from the 1934 World's Fair in New York City. So we just made up stuff and put it on there, to just throw it in there. Some of the Borg pieces, Mike did a lot of Borg stuff for both Next Gen and Deep Space Nine, and he used a lot of like model and toy parts. There was a toy line in Japan back in I want to say the 70s and 80s called Zoids. They were like these mechanical dinosaurs, and you could unscrew them and take them apart, because that was the whole thing. You'd get this like motorized box, and then you would take all the parts out of their trays as if like you're a model kit, and you would bolt them all on top of this thing, and then you turn it on. It would be like this motorized dinosaur that could walk. But it had all these great little Technoco bits on them, and we used them regularly on different alien stuff, and Mike would use them on like the Borg arms and other things like that. So you might say it was a real Borgish morgue.
Boo, Max.
Yes.
No,
Hey,
you're doing so well, and then you threw that in there.
The one of our other friends that worked with us, Scott Brodeen, he and I would late night, because you're tired, you want to go home, and you just have to do something to keep yourself going, and we would toss off bad puns back and forth at each other, and we called it our punishment for having to stay late so much. It was our punishment.
It certainly were some grueling days, I'm sure, back in those days. I've heard of people who worked in different behind the scenes departments who have said, basically after every season they'd all get like the cold or flu for a month or something.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I can remember sometimes it was regular. A regular day was to get into the shop at like 9 a.m, which sounds really late until you realize the fact that we were there till 9 p.m. And that was a regular day. And sometimes you could never make plans for the weekend, because you'd make plans, and then next thing you know, the studio's calling, and well, screw that, you aren't getting to have the weekend off, because now you have to make 15 Bajoran assault rifles, and 10 of those have to be good ones for close-up work, and 5 of them have to be rubber stunt ones, and this is going to be your weekend now. So it's all hands on deck, and everybody is in it. I was making a bunch of the small detail panels, and then Bear was making the big main body of it. And as soon as I'd get done one little panel piece, I would then turn it over to somebody in the mold department, who would then mold it, start setting it up to mold it, and then I'd go back and start making another part, so that by the time I'd get all of my little detail parts molded and done, built, and then they would send to get our molding people to mold them, then Bear would have the big main body of the gun done, so we could then mold that. And then one person, all they would do was just mold the main body. Another person, all they were doing was molding the small detail pieces. And then as soon as they got done being casted, those small detail pieces would get cleaned up, primered, and painted, so that then we were all sitting around. Each of us had a gun, and we're gluing all these individual panels onto the gun so we could get them done in time. I mean, literally, they call us on a Thursday afternoon saying, hey, we have to have this done, and it has to be done for Monday morning shoot. They're going to shoot in Bronson Caverns on Monday morning. We need these all on set Monday morning early. And we then went back when we had more time. We actually took out the original pattern masters for the main body of the gun and all these little details, and we glued them on to the main body of the rifle. And then we took and we made another mold of the whole rifle with all the detailed pieces in place, so we wouldn't have to do that again, so we could just simply cast and make the gun, and everything would be there in place. So all we'd have to do is paint it. Nothing like, there's never enough time to do it right, but there's always enough time to do it again. A case in point with that is like that really beautiful Klingon dagger I showed you earlier. That was another case in point like that. They had first had a prop master gave us a drawing. Mike gave him a budget of how much it was going to cost. He said, well, that's a little bit much. Maybe I'll just take something I already have and repaint it. And we're like, well, that's your prerogative to do what you want. You're the boss, you're the prop master. And then almost 5-6 days later, he comes back and go, you know what? The production really likes that other dagger. And so they're going to pay what you wanted for it. They'll pay what you wanted for it now. And Mike then tells them, it's like, well, that's nice, but now it's going to cost you double that. And they're like, why? Why is it going to be double that? It's now you need it overnight. And now I have to have somebody here work on that thing overnight. And after that, they're not going to be any good to me for a couple of days, because they're going to be wiped. They're going to be, unusable to me. And guess what? Since I was the Klingon prop guy, I was the one who built it. I started making it like at 11 o'clock that morning after the phone call about needing it. I made the blade out of one piece of T65 aircraft grade aluminum, which is really nice and firm, but it's also softer, so it's easier to cut and polish, which is why I was able to carve those Klingon glyphs into it using a Dremel tool and some engraving bits. And then the handle was all a bunch of plexiglass glued together over the tang of the blade. I was there all night by myself doing this, getting it all done. And then to add insult to injury, I had to take the prop to set because they couldn't be bothered to send a driver out to come and pick it up from our shop out in the valley. And so since I lived in West Hollywood at the time, I could go to Paramount in Hollywood, drop it off, and then go home. And so I did. I take the prop to set. I find the prop master. I give it to him. He just kind of looks at it like he doesn't even speak to me because he was mad the fact that we had charged him double. But it's like, it was actually his fault. If he had just said yes to the original price, he wouldn't have needed it overnight. He wouldn't have needed to have paid double for it. It really was his own fault. He looks at the dagger, doesn't even say anything to me, doesn't even look at me. He just puts it down and he walks away. Not even so much as a thank you. I was like, wow, what? Am I allowed to curse?
Go for it.
I was like, what a fucking dick. What? I mean, that's the sort of stuff that puts you against somebody into not ever wanting to go that extra step to do something nice for someone. The other prop master we had on the show, he was wonderful. He was awesome. You do anything for him because he would always make sure that he appreciated you and showed you he appreciated you. We would get our cast and crew jackets through him, but we still had to pay them for them ourselves because we weren't on the lot. But if we were on the lot, you got them for free. But us people off the lot were treated kind of like, bastard stepchildren. So I mean, that's just, it's like, really, does it hurt your ego to be nice to someone?
As you said earlier, the bread butters both sides, right?
Yeah, if it would have been different if it had at least been nice to us. And that person has now passed away, so oh well, I don't care.
Now, we should add to talk about some Klingon stuff again. You also had a hand in making the Sword of Kahless, which is like one of the most iconic DS9 props. But I know there's been some debate about what your involvement actually was. So maybe you can kind of clear up that and tell us the whole story behind the Sword of Kahless.
Well, I didn't actually build the Sword of Kahless. I made the display base for the Sword of Kahless. The Sword of Kahless was designed by Dan Curry, who's an amazing, really awesome guy, effects coordinator and designer. He also had a lot of experience in the Asian fighting arts. And so he was the one who designed the original bat'leth for Next Gen. And then from that, designing the Sword of Kahless for Deep Space Nine. And then that was turned over to one of our guys who made the sword itself, which is made to look like what's called a Damascus steel finish. So it has all these undulations in it, because Damascus steel is made, I'm not a metallurgist, but from my understanding, Damascus steel is made by folding the metal over itself while it's being forged and pounded, and that's what gives it its unique texture. The original was made out of one piece of aluminum. We took a mold off of it. We cast them in either resin, hard urethane resin, or for the stunt fighting ones, they were made out of a rubber, a synthetic urethane elastomer, which feels very much like car tires. It's a little bit soft, but it has a hardness like a car tire. And then we would cast them, and then we would put the leather strapping on them. But I designed and I made the base for the Sword of Kahless. Very last minute, Alan Sims was the prop master for that for Deep Space Nine, and he was the nice of the two prop masters. Alan Sims is an awesome fellow, and it was like, oh my God, you know what? They didn't call out a stand. They never said anything about it, and so in other words, it's just going to be laying there. He says, that's not very cool looking. He says, could you make me like a stand really quick? He said, well, yeah, I have that. The year before that, I had made a costume for myself and my friend Mary Cordero, which we wore to Worldcon in San Francisco. We won first place for best workmanship for our costumes. And I designed all these Klingon glyphs, my own custom shapes and everything for it. And I pulled out the molds and I showed them to Alan. He goes, oh yeah, these will work great. He says, yeah, we can use these. And I showed, look, we can use this shape. We can put that one there. We'll put this one there, and we'll put that there and this. And so I literally designed it on the fly right there in front of him. I said, well, we'll have these two wooden rods, which will hold up the sword, and then we'll put a rectangular base on it. So I basically designed the base for the Sword of Kahless, and all of those glyphic shapes are my own design work. So that's what I did for the Sword of Kahless. And then a couple of years later, Alan, we were still working on Deep Space Nine. Alan brought me a Sword of Kahless, and it was one of the ones they had used, a stunt one that they used for fighting. It was pretty banged up. He said, could you fix this up for me? And I said, I tell you what, Alan, I have a spare casting right here. Wouldn't you rather have this bright, shiny, brand new one, and compared to me fixing up this shitty old one that's all beat up and torn? And I'll tell you what, I'll do it for you for free if you let me have the original. And that's what I did. Alan was like, I don't care. I'll take the brand new one. I'll let you have the shitty old one. But that shitty old one is green used, and I have it to this day. I have it.
Now we know what happened to it after Worf let it out the airlock.
Exactly. And I have. Now I don't know how many of the stunt ones that they use for fighting we made. Usually we'll send 2 to set, but again, I don't know. It's been such a long time, so I might have the only one. There might be another one. I don't know, but I have it hanging on my wall in my staircase. I used my staircase kind of like as a display. So much blank walls. I used it to put stuff up on, and it hangs on the wall there with a bunch of my other Star Trek stuff. That Star Trek wall communicator I showed you earlier hangs on the same wall next to the Sword of Kahless. So I have like a whole little Klingon area there.
Now, we should also mention, by the way, folks, we talked about Max's podcast, the Max FX podcast, but in case you don't know, Michael Moore also has a YouTube channel called Propology 101, and you, in fact, did an interview with him. And
I did.
I don't like to rehash old stories, but consider this, folks, a preview and a reason why you should go check out the Propology 101 channel as well. You told a story about one of the most annoying props you worked on, and that's the Ketracel white tubes. I'd love to hear about that.
Oh my God.
That expression, that reaction.
Yes. Well, it's always difficult when you're having to work with stuff and you're making it out of clear plastic, because clear plastic on camera, for whatever reason, maybe it's the lighting or whatever, it will just show every single little flaw. And with the Ketracel white tubes, they weren't something off the shelf. I had to go take plain, regular, clear plexiglass tubing and cut them all into angled shapes, but yet they all have to be identical, because there was going to be a shot with them all line up next to each other. So they have to look identical, as if they were something factory made. And they're these weird angled shaped tubes. Yes, you know what? Yeah, I know they look great for camera because it's alien and they should be weird looking. But I curse whoever decided to make them angled like that. So I thought, well, the easiest way to make them all and make them look similar would be to make what we call in the aerospace industry a jig, so that I can use this jig so that when I cut the parts, all of the parts will be the same. So you can take the piece of raw tubing, drop it into the jig, slide it through the bandsaw, and because the jig is set up to be repeatable, it will always cut the piece of tubing the same length at the same angle. So you start making like a kit of parts of all these pieces of all these shapes. And then you have to glue them together very, very carefully so you don't drip glue on the clear tubing, because if you do, that one's ruined. You now have to throw it out because that glue will dry and leave a little mark. And then you have to glue an end cap, which is because you've cut the tube at an angled shape. The tube is no longer round. It's now an oval. And you have to cut a piece of, I mean, it's literally a piece of plexiglass smaller than a dime into an oval shape, glue it on the end, and then sand it so the edges are all like clear, like glass. And then on top of that all, you're having to make a stopper which goes into the end and has to be watertight, so that once they fill the tubes with the Ketracel white, which was really just, we used distilled water, and I found an iridescent powder. It was made for mixing into paint, so you could make any color paint with an iridescent, sheen, kind of like a butterfly's wings. And when you would shake this stuff up, much like glitter in a snow globe, it would stay suspended for a few minutes at a time. And since it was a white powder, iridescent, that's where it gets its name, the Ketracel white. The white was called out in the script, so we had to make whatever was inside the tubes white with this glitter look, so it would look more interesting. It only had the glitter look to it, so it would look interesting on camera. So I then had to make this stopper shape, which I then made a mold of, and we cast them in urethane plastic. They had to be trimmed, sanded, painted, and such. And then there's a little O-ring around the round stopper. The O-ring is a rubber ring so that it makes a watertight seal. So after gluing, you might do all this work of cutting all these shapes, gluing it together, putting it together, and then you do a water test to make sure it doesn't leak, and then find out it leaks somewhere. And now you've got to plug it so it doesn't leak. And I think for the first batch, I think I made like 20 of those things, 20 of them. Not a bad failure rate. I think I only had 2, maybe 3 that didn't come out right out of the whole bunch, but I had to make 20 because it had to fill this box, but oh my God, those Ketracel white containers. And then they would get broken on set, and then I'd have to make replacements. I think I made another 15 later down the line or so. I can't remember. the exact number, but I just know it was a lot of them and I hated them. So much work for such a little insignificant object. If it had been a straight tube, we could have gone out and just bought test tubes, because they make plastic test tubes that were almost the right size. We could have just done that, but no. Star Trek's going to have these fancy bent clear plastic tubes. And we also made a lot of the little technical doodads that were part of wardrobe that were on the Jemadars costumes. And that was another case of getting to use fun little, like model kit parts that we would make the basic shape that the designers had drawn, but to give them extra detail, we would use little model kit parts, which we in the model making business called nurnies, greeblies. We just glue these extra pieces on for that sort of reason. So that was always fun. There was some later episodes with the Jem'Hadar where we had gotten a bunch of molds that were left over from Independence Day, and they were some of the weird alien ship shapes and some of the armor that the Jem'Hadar are wearing, like as backpacks and such, are rubber castings off of these molds that we took from Independence Day that the Jem'Hadar are wearing. So it makes sense. They're aliens. Those are aliens. Why not? Why not? We'll just reuse it. It's all getting painted dark metallic colors. You won't really notice it too much.
So Max, what's something that you know today that you wish you knew back when you were first starting out in the industry?
I wish I knew back then what a giant impact computers were going to make on the industry. I'm just now getting into teaching myself 3D modeling. So that's one thing.
And computers and 3D printing, it's really kind of changed prop making as a whole. And we talked to
It
Michael more
has
about that as well. I mean, how much has that affected what you do?
a lot. The last several years, I've actually been lucky enough to continue doing much more model making, traditional model making than you would expect. But even then, we still use a lot of 3D printing, even for model making. We did a year ago, I've been working for Vision Scenery, which is up here in the San Fernando Valley. And last year, we built a big model that was like almost 35 feet long of the state of California, which was built as a tourist promotional item that eventually got installed in a train station in London. And it got installed 2 weeks before the COVID lockdown happened. But to help make all the cities quicker, we 3D printed little buildings, and we would just print them out in different scales and different types of houses getting painted different ways, so we could use the same little house in different scales, printed and painted differently to make the cities look much more busy and full. So that's a big boon. It doesn't always take away our work. I just got done 2 months ago doing a big city model for Paramount. I can't say what the name of the project is yet because it hasn't come out. But in it, we built a lot of buildings scratch because we had to duplicate buildings that really exist on the Paramount backlot because they were going to be doing live action filming in front of these buildings. And then a lot of the buildings are simple cardboard paste ups because they're in the background. They're going to be an office tower. And so we just did up artwork on the computer in like Photoshop, and we just pasted these artworks onto these cardboard, tubes to be buildings in the background. So, 3D modeling is like anything. It's another tool. It has its place, and you have to know how to learn and use your tools, whether it be practical tools that you use in your hand or ones you do with a computer or a 3D printer or whatever. It's all about getting to know your tools and using them properly for the job at hand.
I think that's a great answer. And, Max, there's so much more I wanted to talk with you about today, but no, we're going to have to do a sequel at some point again to cover everything else. But today, for our final wrap up for this episode of Max Cervantes taking over Trek Untold, what is the best thing about being a part of the Star Trek universe?
For me, it's knowing I got to work on something that means so much to me. I have loved Star Trek ever since I was a little boy, because I think it was the first time I ever saw a future that was hopeful and that included all sorts of types of people. Commodore Mendez in the episode he appears in, the two-parter of the Menagerie. That's the first time I'd ever seen somebody with a Latino name who wasn't somebody's gardener or somebody's taxi driver, but instead he's a Commodore. He's somebody really important. He ranks over Kirk and Spock, and that meant a lot to me as a little Latino kid. And getting to see so many different types of people all getting along, all having a common goal of going out and exploring this amazing galaxy we all exist and live in, that means a lot to me, of getting to work on something like that and getting to be part of it, and knowing that in some little way my career, as small as it is, means something to others.
Well, I would never downplay anything you did as small on Star Trek. I think it's all very significant to building the world that we all love and appreciate. So thank you on behalf of all Star Trek fans for all the work and all the hours, and the grueling hours, I should say, that you've given for the Star Trek universe.
Hours, yes.
Yeah, so again, thank you, Max, so much. It's been really great to chat with you, and I'm glad we got to demystify a little bit about who Max Cervantes is and dive deep a little bit into his resume, this mysterious resume you have.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all your time and letting me talk about all this stuff. Because believe me, anybody who knows me will tell you I'm a talker. I will talk your ears off if I'm given half a chance.
And that's why you've got the Max FX podcast. And that's, I think, a pretty great plug and a good way to end this interview. So check out the Max FX podcast if you want even more from Max, because he's got a whole lot more. We barely even scratched the surface today of all the stories you've got. So yeah, again, my gratitude for giving us so much time today and sharing. And we really should do it again sometime.
You're very welcome, and thank you. I would love to do this again.
And that was our chat with Max Cervantes. Some really great stories in there, and some really amazing details in there also that I never knew about. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you listeners out there as well haven't heard these stories either. So thanks again to Max for sharing all of the stories about his time in Hollywood and many of the secrets behind the Star Trek props. And for anybody out there who is interested in making props as well for film, television, or whatever, I hope you got some inspiring things from this episode too. And don't forget to check out the Max FX podcast, which you can find on skywalkingthroughneverland.com, as well as other major audio platforms. Of course, we're going to have links for those in our show notes. One of the most iconic props in the original Star Trek series was what we know in modern times as a pad device. This slate-looking item was essentially the iPad of its time, before iPads were even a thought. But the original pad from the 60s was not quite as high-tech. In fact, instead, it was built with a wooden body that housed a 12-volt light on the top, and within that, a magic slate toy. You know those magic slate toys, the thin gray sheets that you drew on using a magnetic pencil? Yeah, those things you could buy in a pharmacy for like $2. That was part of the high-tech technology of the 1960 Star Trek show. They still make those magnetic things today, and back in the 60s when they filmed the first Star Trek series, that's what they used to make the first iteration of the pad, which is crazy to think about. So when it comes to props, repurposing household objects and everyday things is nothing that's too out of the ordinary. But did you ever think that funny little toy that you could pick up in a Walgreens right now for a few bucks would actually be part of one of the most iconic things ever in Star Trek history? Go figure. That's it for this week's episode of Trek Untold. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Trek Untold, which is just one word in all those platforms. If you're listening to this on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or any of those other locations, please leave a positive review and a 5-star rating if you can to help show other listeners how much you like this podcast and spread the word. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel at youtube.com/nerdnewstoday. If you're enjoying Trek Untold and in a position to financially support the show, I hope you consider being one of our Patreon supporters by visiting patreon.com/trekuntold, where you can help us out for as low as $2 a month and get some pretty sweet perks. Shout out once again to Triple Fiction Productions, who you can check out at triple-fictionproductions.net. If you're a collector of Star Trek toys in any size or scale, or enjoy prop replicas, you're going to love the quality of their 3D printed products, and I'm sure you will be a repeat customer. If you have any comments, feedback, or suggestions for future guests, send an email to me at trekuntold@gmail.com. I hope you'll beam up again with us next week for another episode of Trek Untold. So until then, I'm Matthew. Thanks for listening, and remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com, promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the RageWorks podcasting network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.